My name is Kirk, and I'm the lead pastor here at Living Hope, and I'm so glad that you chose to join us this morning. You know, it's summertime. This weekend marks the beginning of summer. Now, I know that summer started a couple weeks ago. I know there was that day when we said summer started. And I know if you're American, summer technically starts Memorial Day weekend, but for Canadians, it starts with July 1st, doesn't it? It starts with the July 1st weekend. And so this is summertime, and one of the things that I look forward to every single summer is all of the movies that come out over the course of the summer. You know, this past weekend, Despicable Me 3 started this past weekend. Next weekend, Spider-Man Homecoming comes out. The weekend after that, Battle for the Planet of the Apes comes out. I know where I'm going to be for the next 3 weekends because I just love movies. You know, movies help me escape when I've had a hard week or a hard day. Movies tickle my funny bone and make me laugh out loud. Movies can even bring tears to my eyes. Movies educate me about issues and things that are going on. Movies inspire me to do something, to take action. And I don't think I'm alone in this. I think there's other people in this room right now who like movies as well. I think a lot of us probably like a good barrel of popcorn and a good movie, either on the TV or on the big screen. You know, movies are something that our culture loves. And you know, in all my movie watching, I've noticed something. I've noticed that in the movies that I watch, that there is often a deeper story. A deeper story that is actually a very familiar story. Have you noticed this as you've watched movies? That there is a deeper story, an ancient story. Actually, it's God's story. I'll be watching a movie from time to time, and all of a sudden, out will pop something, a principle or a truth that actually is God's principle or truth. I was doing that a few weeks ago. Britt and I went and saw Wonder Woman. There's a theme in the movies I like. They're all superhero movies. And I'm watching Wonder Woman, all of a sudden, I'm like, wow, there is a story here. There is Christology, the study of Christ, in this movie about a female superhero. It's twisted and it's marred, but there is a story here of sacrifice. There's a story here of temptation, of love. And it shouldn't come as a surprise to us at all that actually we see God's story a lot of times in the movies that we watch because God actually told us that this is what He's going to do. Romans 1:19 says this. It says, they know the truth about God because He has made it obvious to Him. You see, God wants to be in relationship with us. He wants us to know Him, and so He has made it obvious that He exists. And it goes on, and it says this. It says, for ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and the sky. Anybody see the earth and the sky this morning as they came to church? We all have, right? And we cannot help when we see a beautiful sunset to go, wow. We cannot help it when we see a great prairie landscape to just marvel at the beauty, even of flat spaces, right? And we cannot help but see the majesty and the wonder when we are driving through or camping in the Rocky Mountains. And all of us at one point or another, whether we follow Jesus or not, all of us in this world at one point or another have wondered, how did all that happen? How did all that come into being? And it says, well, God made it obvious that He did it. Through everything God made. Through everything God made. This includes you. That actually the mountains and the sunset and the prairie landscape and even you bear His fingerprints. Through everything God made, they can clearly see His invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. Genesis 1 says, this is the story of how everything beginning. It says that we are created in the image of God. You and I are image bearers. And that this creation bears fingerprints of who God is. If this was a crime scene, you know, I love crime movies, and when they always kind of follow the same plot. What happens is something happens, and then there is this group of people that swarm in, and they're usually in white jumpsuits. And they start looking for hairs and fingerprints and footprints and DNA fragments. And they're looking to see who did the crime, right? If this world was a crime scene, God didn't hide any of the evidence. And He makes it clear. And you and I are image bearers. And that image bearing when we create something, that we actually pass on a piece of that image. This is why when we see Van Gogh's Starry Night, we wonder and we are amazed at the beauty that God has in this world. This is why when we hear a song, that it lifts us up and inspires us to worship. This is why when we watch a movie, that we can see Jesus, even though that story has twisted and marred the image of God even further than it is in us. You see, in movies, we can often see the deeper story because the people who created bear a marred image of God, and they've passed it on into the story. And in the summertime, last summer we did this for the first time. This summer we're going to do it again. For the next 2 months, this is summer at the movies. And so there's going to be popcorn every single week. And we're going to use movies that you can get on Netflix, that you can rent on iTunes, movies that you can watch with your family, and we're going to look at the deeper story. Some of them are very obvious and they speak about God. Others, you have to kind of look at them. And we're going to explore God's truth using illustrations from the movies. And the theme that's going to run through these next 10 weeks is actually the 10 Commandments. Hollywood loves top 10 lists, don't they? They're always making top 10 lists. Talk show hosts love top 10 lists. We like top 10 lists. And the 10 Commandments is really God's top 10 list of how to have a great life. And so each week we're going to look at a different one. And this morning we're going to look at the first commandment, the first of God's top 10 lists. I know top 10 lists are supposed to start at 10 and count down to 1, but the top one for God actually unlocks all of the other 9. And we're going to do that this morning using the movie The Prince of Egypt, which tells the story of how the 10 Commandments, how God's top 10, the first top 10, came into existence. Let's watch the first clip. Well, I learned the 10 Commandments when I was just a kid. Every Wednesday night as a kid, my parents would take me to our church that we were attending in Hamilton, Ontario, and I would go to something called Christian Service Brigade. It was kind of like, I don't know, like Beavers in a Christian version kind of thing, or, kind of like an outdoor kind of theme. And I would learn verses from the Bible, and they would give you a badge that was for memorizing certain things. And one of the things was for memorizing the 10 Commandments, and I wanted that badge. And so I memorized the 10 Commandments, and our kids in our midweek clubs here at the church still kind of do something similar to that, and they learn different verses, and some of them have learned the 10 Commandments over the years. And it was something I also learned in Sunday school. It was something I also learned in children's church, and by the time I was 10, the 10 Commandments had been drilled into me. And the 10 Commandments were drilled into me in such a way that I saw them as rules that you better not break or else. And maybe that's how you see them as well. Maybe you grew up like I did and they were something that you were taught as a child, something that you grew up, and they became this thing that you better not break or else. Or maybe you didn't grow up in a church or in a faith background, but you still heard about the 10 Commandments because they are a lot of the foundation of our laws are often based on them. And maybe that's how you see them as well, is that these are rules, do's and don'ts that God has given. And so why would you ever want to spend 10 weeks talking about a bunch of rules, right? And you're thinking, I'm not coming back next week. And you know what? Talking for 10 weeks about rules doesn't excite me at all either. What I want to suggest to you this morning is that this is not about rules. We call them the 10 Commandments, I get it. But actually, I see them differently. And I think God sees them differently. And what I want to suggest to you is that the 10 Commandments are actually the keys to a great life. That actually God gave them because He wants us to have a full life. He wants us to have the life that we were created to have, and that this is the key to finding that life. To understand why I say that, first we have to understand where these 10 Commandments come from. And the movie that we are watching clips of this morning tells the story of how they came about. It tells the first 20 chapters of the book of Exodus that we're going to look at. And in the first clip that we saw slaves singing, and they were saying, "Deliver us." And for 400 years, a group of people called the Hebrews had been living as slaves in the nation of Egypt. They were not seen as people, they were seen as commodities. They were seen as things to be used to build an empire. but they were waiting for a promise that someone would deliver them to freedom. And in the midst of that, at one point, the Egyptians decided to do some population control and kill off all the newborn babies. And a mother, you saw that in the clip, took her baby and hid him in a basket and pushed him out into the Nile River. And God protected that baby and took him to Pharaoh's house, to the daughter of Pharaoh, who adopted him, raised him as a son, raised him as a prince of Egypt, and his name was Moses. And Moses, as an adult, was in a unique position, having been trained and equipped to lead like a nation's leader. He is in a unique position to deliver his people. And Moses sets out to be the leader that God created him to be. And his first foray out, you know what happens? He kills a guy trying to protect a Hebrew. He kills an Egyptian who was whipping him. And Moses, in fear, flees for his life. And for 40 years, he lives in exile until the clip that we just saw. He's living as a herdsman, and he goes up to this mountain, Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. And there he encounters God. And God says, I want you to go back to Egypt. And I want you to deliver my people. I want you to tell Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to set my people free. And Moses goes back. And there is this battle of wills that takes place between God and Pharaoh, and a battle of miracles. The supernatural happens, and finally, Pharaoh gives in. His will is broken because he can't compete with our God. And he sets the people, the Hebrews, free. And Moses leads them to Mount Sinai, where he encountered God, where he first met God. And what does God say to the people? Exodus 20 tells us. We're going to look at Exodus 20, verses 1 to 3. This is on page 59 of the Brown Bibles, and it says this. God speaks to the people of the Hebrews for the first time. They're at the mountain, and he's speaking through Moses, and here's what he says. He says, next slide, then God gave the people all these instructions. So this is God speaking. Moses wrote this part, God wrote this part. It says, I am the Lord your God, who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. And then he says this, you must not have any other God but me. Of all the first words to speak, why does God lead with a command? Why does God lead with a rule? I mean, after everything that he's done, the first words that we have being spoken to the Hebrew nation, this new Hebrew nation, are, you must have no other God but me. Why would he do this? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to verse 2. And here's what verse 2 says. God says, I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. And in Exodus, when God introduces himself first to Moses, then to the people, he uses this technique of referring to things in the past. With Moses, we saw this in the clip. He says, I am the God of your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now here he says, I am the God who rescued you from the land of Egypt. Think of it this way. It's like you introducing someone and then telling them what they do or what they did. So yesterday I was at the game and I was with some people and they introduced me to someone. And they said, oh, this is Kirk. He was that guy that was on stage that was speaking a couple weeks ago. Don't we get introduced that way? I used to work for Ambrose, and whenever I was introduced as Ambrose, I was introduced as, this is Kirk, he's the director of IT. He's the guy that ran into the burning building to save the servers during the fire. And what I did in the past became what defined who I am today. And God introduces himself first to Moses. He says, I am the God of your forefathers. He says this to a man who is basically an orphan. He says, I'm the God of your forefathers. You have a family. And these are who they are. And I am the God of them. But he's also saying to Moses, you know those things that I did for your forefathers, for Abraham, for Isaac, for Jacob? How I gave children to a man who didn't have children, even though he was too old to have children, and his wife was as old as him? I'm that God. The God who gave Jacob a fortune. That's what he does. He gives him more sheep, more herds than anyone else. I'm that God. And the implication is, Moses, I'm sending you back to see Pharaoh. And all those things I did for your forefathers, I will do for you today. But there's another reason why God introduces himself like this. He says, I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. God has just led the Hebrews to Mount Sinai after battling Pharaoh. And he says, I'm the God who brought all those plagues. I'm the God who parted the Red Sea so that you could walk through it on dry ground. That is me. I am the God who rescued you from your slavery. You had been slave for 400 years. You couldn't rescue yourself, and so I did it. That's the God that I am. And then he follows it with the next verse where he says, you should have no other God but me. And God is not establishing a bunch of rules for us to follow. What he is doing is saying, here's the God that I am. And I am inviting you to experience freedom for the first time in generations. I set you free so that you could be free. And it seems counterintuitive to us to say God gives them freedom, but then he gives them rules, doesn't it? That's not freedom, is it? We have this opinion of freedom that says freedom is the absence of rules. You know, we get this as a teenager where we say, I cannot wait to get out from my parents' house when I will be free and do whatever I want. But it's amazing how even as young adults, there's still rules in our life, isn't there? That we actually create rules about our car and our apartment when it comes to our friends. And so we get out from underneath our parents' rules, but we create our own rules. And here's the thing, freedom is not the absence of law. Freedom is the ability to choose what you'll do. And God brings the people out. He says, I have set you free, and I want to be in relationship with you. But here is what freedom looks like. You see, we need to set the context for what freedom looks like, because freedom is not the absence of law. It is the ability to choose what you will do. And the Hebrews had never had a choice of what they could do. They were told when to get up. They were told how many bricks to make. They were told when to lay down. And God says, you are free. Don't go back into slavery. And the starting point to your freedom is recognizing that there is one God and that I'm it. And that all the other things that we're going to talk about, if you will get this one thing right, that there is one God, that you will live free and never be a slave again. You see, we have to think about freedom this way. A number of years ago, when my kids were little, we got a trampoline. And this was an inherited trampoline. It wasn't brand new out of the box. It was about 10 years old when we got it. It had been my parents when they had foster kids, and then it had been my brother's when he had had little kids, and then it was passed to us. And so it didn't have a net around it. Now when you buy a trampoline, you get a net around it, right? Because we want to protect our kids. This one did not have it, and you can see Liam and Emma jumping on the trampoline. That was the first day that we got it. And they had so much fun just jumping up and down and jumping up and down. But then Britt and I decided, you know what, we want to put a net around this thing. And so we hunted around and we found a net and we put a net around it. And all of a sudden the jumping changed. Where my kids would just kind of jump up and down and up and down. Now all of a sudden Liam started doing flips. Emma started jumping as high as she possibly could. Why? Because the net created a framework around them where they could truly be free. And they played games on it. They played for hours. They did backflips. They did stunts that I'd never seen before. Because the net provided them a framework of safety and freedom. And God says, you should have no other God but me, because this is the starting point to discovering freedom. I rescued you out of Egypt. The Hebrews lived in what's called a polytheistic world. It means there's many gods. And even Pharaoh was considered a god. So when God defeats Pharaoh, actually God says, I'm better than that God. And God says, you can worship other gods if you want, but you'll become a slave to that. Maybe you came out of a faith tradition where it's that God, the God that you served, required you to do good things in order to gain his approval, to have relationship with him. The God who rescued the Hebrews, how does he introduce himself? I am the God who rescued you. This is his greeting. He says, I did this for you. Now let's have relationship together. There's no requirement of anything. But he says if we're going to be in relationship, here's the parameters that need to be around this. You can live however you want. You're free. Here's what freedom with me looks like. You know what? I am free today, but at the same time, there are rules around me that govern my relationship with my wife. And if you're married, you probably have them too. But I would still say I'm free. I'm not a slave to Britain, but I choose to live within a framework of safety, a framework of freedom, and God invites us to do the same thing, and the starting point is to have one God. So who is your God? Because we still live in a polytheistic world today. And our God could be another faith structure, but our God could be something completely different. It could be a career, it could be a way of life, it could be our family, it could be all sorts of things that we put up on a pedestal and that starts to become the framework or the worldview for how we see things. And we can quickly become a slave to that God. But the God of the Hebrews says, I want to rescue you and I want to give you freedom. And the framework that I put around you, this will give you life. We've talked about two reasons why God gave this first commandment. The first is that this establishes the parameters for freedom. It says, here's what freedom looks like. And you can be a slave or you can live free. And we've talked about how having one God also unites us as one family, that we all are part of one people when we worship the same God. The last reason that God gives us this commandment to have one God, it all has to do with confusing information. Have you ever had confusing information given to you or confusing instructions given to you? When I worked in information technology, I was part of a team that was looking at all of the privacy legislations that were coming in around the turn of the millennia. And every level of government was imposing new privacy legislation, PIPA and PIPEDA and FOIP, and that's Alberta. But it's just all these different, there was 3 different legislations, and actually there was even different versions of the legislation that we were dealing with. And each legislation had certain requirements, and certain requirements trumped other requirements, and it was just kind of confusing to figure out what was going on. And as a team, we had to figure out what applied to our organization and what didn't. But to make matters worse, we had an organization of 100 people working with us who were watching the news and listening to what the guys on the newscast would say about the privacy legislation. And they would hear a sound bite, and they would come into my office the next morning and they would say, Kirk, we have to be doing this. And they had no idea about any of the other legislation that actually overruled anything that they were talking about. And it was incredibly confusing for everyone involved. Have you ever had conflicting information or conflicting instructions? Maybe your boss has come in and told you to do something, and then right after they left, her boss came in and said you should do it this way instead. Now who do you listen to? Or maybe mom and dad have each given you 2 different set of instructions, and you want to honor your parents because you hear that's one of the 10 commandments, but how do you do that when they're each giving you conflicting information? And you know what? God knows how frustrating it is for all of us when we receive conflicting information. And this is why he gave the 10 commandments. This is why the first commandment is to have one God. Because one God takes out all of the conflicting information that we can have in the world. You see, whatever is our God in our life, this is what we build the framework of our life, the worldview that we have around. And if it is God, the God of the Hebrews, the God of the Bible, then we will live very differently than if it is another God. There was a guy who lived hundreds of years after Moses, after God had given the 10 commandments. His name was Solomon. Maybe you've heard of him. If you've ever heard someone say you have the wisdom of Solomon, it's a reference to this guy who lived hundreds of years after Moses, who is described in the Bible. He was a very wise king of the Hebrews, who we call Israel. He was the king of the Israelites. And Solomon worshiped the one God. When he was young, God appeared to him. Can you imagine that? God actually appearing to you? And God appears to him, and he says to him, "What do you want? Ask anything." Can you imagine having God show up and say, "What do you want?" Anybody got a laundry list of things that they want, right? Solomon, as a young man, after worshiping God, God shows up to him and says, "What do you want?" And he says, "I'd like wisdom." And God says, "You can have wisdom, and actually, because you asked for something like that, I'm going to give you power, I'm going to give you money, I'm going to give you success as well." And Solomon worships the one God. And God shows up for Solomon not once, but twice in his life. He appears to Solomon. Do you know how rare that is in all of the Bible, in all of the stories of the Bible? This is incredibly rare for God to show up twice in a person's life. Solomon sees God, and you would think that this would cause him to follow God all of his life, but he doesn't. Solomon knows this command. You see, when Solomon first became king, one of the requirements of the king in those days was that they would hand write out all of the commandments, the first 5 books of what would be our Old Testament. By hand, write it out, your own personal copy, and then keep it with you all the time. That was a commandment that all the kings had to follow, and Solomon followed it. But Solomon, at some point in his life, decided that he knew better than what God wanted. And he began worshiping other gods. We're told that he wrote a book about his life, actually, called Ecclesiastes, where he says, "I pursued anything that I wanted." Anything was his God. He said, "If I desired pleasure, I pursued pleasure. If I desired riches, I pursued riches. If I desired more wisdom, I pursued that." And all of it is chasing after the wind, he says. It's meaningless. It's worthless. And Solomon, in his old age, doesn't worship God. 1 Kings 11 says this. It says, in Solomon's old age, they turned. They. Who's they? Well, see, Solomon had a lot of wives. And in his old age, Solomon's wives turned his heart towards other gods. You see, Solomon, he actually starts this. You remember about the time when I said that God appeared to him and said, "What do you want?" You know, right before that in 1 Kings 3, it says that Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter. Remember Pharaoh, the guy back in Egypt? They worshiped other gods, right? And not only that, but he built a shrine to Pharaoh's daughter's God. I don't know how to reconcile that. How do you worship one God and build a shrine to another God? Well, it didn't go well for Solomon because he did that. And he married more wives, and he started building shrines to their gods as well. And then he began offering sacrifices. He began worshiping their God instead of being completely faithful to the Lord his God as his father David had commanded. And Solomon no longer has one God, he has many gods. And the criticism that's given, God says, "I'm done. And your kingdom will be destroyed after you die. It'll be torn in two. I'm only going to let you keep your kingdom because your dad was faithful and worshiped one God. But I'm done." And Solomon had started out so well. He'd seen God. He'd asked God for wisdom. He'd been humble. He'd worshiped one God. But then somewhere along the line, he started listening to other people and other guidance. And he got conflicting information. And this led him astray from the one God. And God says to the Hebrews, you need to have one God because you've just come out of a system, out of a worldview, the Egyptian worldview, where there are many gods, and you offer to this God if you want to have a child. You offer to this God if you're having a drought. You offer to this God if you want this. And you've got all that information that you were slaves with, but now we're starting something new. And if you want to be in relationship with me, if you want to be truly free and not a slave to all these other gods, then you need to worship one God, because otherwise you're going to have conflicting information. And God desperately wants to guide you. He wants to guide you to the life that you were created to have. And as long as you have more than one God, you have conflicting information in your life. And you will second guess what God has to say about the way we should be living today. Jesus says something about this in Matthew. He says, no one can serve two masters. We think we can. We think we can serve two masters. Have you ever had two bosses at work? Some of you I know work in a matrix situation. How's that working out for you? Is that lots of fun? So I've done this. I've had two bosses. It's not always fun. It's challenging, isn't it? No one can serve two masters. For you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. You could put anything you want in there for the place of money. You cannot serve both God and your career. You cannot serve both God and your family. You cannot serve both God and a life of leisure. You will despise one and love the other. God knows this about us. That when we get conflicting information, we'll take the one that is easier. We'll take the one that we think, that sounds like it's an easier thing for me to do. That sounds like it's going to lead to pleasure, but it never does. Instead, it leads to slavery. And that's the opposite of what God wants for you. He wants freedom, and that doesn't always mean that it's going to be easy, but it always means you're free and that you get to discover the life that He has for you. So, my question for you today is, if one God leads to freedom, if one God leads to unity, if one God will give you guidance to the life that we all crave, then who is the God, or what is the God of your life? Who is the God, or what is the God of your life? Because we live in a polytheistic world. Whether we realize it or not, the gods may not be idols that sit on a wall, but they are no less pervasive in our world today. They may go by different names, but they are still gods. And they still want to enslave us and take away from us the life that God has for us. You know that you're in slavery. I was thinking about this. How do we know if we're in slavery to some other God? You know that you're in slavery if the way that you're living can't be sustained without the activity that you have to do. So if you've set up a system of living, and if money is your God, let's pick that one because it's an easy one. If you've set up a style of living that requires a certain level of income, and if your level of income was to drop by, say, $20,000, and your world would fall apart because there's no car anymore, there's no house anymore, then there's slavery going on here. And we can do that with all sorts of things in our life. If there's a system or a way of living that isn't sustainable for us, then we need to look at our lives and consider who or what is the God that we are serving. Who are we slaves to? God wants us to have freedom, and it starts by recognizing who He is and that He is the God who rescues us from slavery. And so if our finances are upside down, if our career is upside down, if our family is upside down, this is a God who rescues us from the slavery that we put ourselves into. He did it for the Hebrews. He wants to do it for us. He wants to give us a way of living that is not a bunch of rules to follow, but is a framework that gives us freedom. And it all starts. That door to the freedom is unlocked through one God. So who is it that you are following? What is your God today? Maybe today it's time to declare that you will worship the one God who rescued the Hebrews and wants to rescue you.